This is Gnosis of the Body, where we explore embodied wisdom in healing the mind-body split through personal stories, using Jungian depth psychology, mythology, and following collective trends, and following wisdom stories of the body. Just now sitting outside in my morning meditation and here in the Northern Hemisphere getting my daily dose of what and when it's possible of vitamin D, au naturel, in the fading days of sunlight that we have here in England. I was reading a text here by Carolyn Myss about self-examination, contemplation, and silence, and reflecting back on something from the conversation with Matthew, something Matthew said.
It's about connection to and relation to the Godhead. The Western myths from the Fertile Crescent onwards through the monotheistic faiths, they're all a creator and his creation. And we're the creation and we can relate to the creator, but we are different from the creator. The Eastern religions from India and China and Japan have always been, you are that. You and the Godhead are one, and it's about you re-becoming that. You don't have that in the West. You're not allowed to be God in the West. I think that's where the excitement of the Eastern wisdom coming into America since the 50s, I think has been this missing key of like, hey, you're like what the Gnostic Gospels say, like you're allowed to participate in this.
And how training and then meditating and finding silence in the discipline of yoga, Buddhist meditation, yogic philosophy, that perspective of thou art that, finding silence, finding meditation in that discipline was very, very different to me than finding it in the Christian tradition of my birth and my culture of origin. And I think this might be a big reason why many Westerners are drawn to yoga. As I discussed with Matthew, I found compassion in that discipline, whereas I did not find any in the doctrine of the Christian faith, which preaches separation from the Godhead and that you are always lower, you are worshiping, you are asking. And so I just want to read this text. And so this is from Carolyn Myss's Entering the Castle. Contemplation. The complement of self-examination nourishes your soul. It stimulates your relationship with the divine. Silence is the friend who never betrays, wrote Confucius. Silence is the one and only voice of God, wrote Melville. All religious traditions have a history of seeking silence as a path to God, the light, the way. Silence is an invitation to the divine to come forward, reveal itself to you as a presence more than an active guidance. You wait to experience the presence of God without an agenda, without a prayer list filled of requests that cover myriad fears and insecurities. This is a new experience for many people who seem to lack the patience to wait for God. They want to pray and run, speak their list of requests in their mind as if they're presenting a shopping list to Santa at Christmas, and then tell themselves they are officially protected by God because they've just prayed for protection. Contemplation is the discipline of piercing through the ego's self-centeredness and impatience. And that actually is something which, through the Buddhist doctrine, I don't know if it's specifically Buddhist, but the Eastern doctrine, as I was trained in meditation with, of killing the ego, of allowing the silence to speak. And specifically, the silence for me arose in bodily sensation. And sometimes those sensations have an emotion, And we're taught in the practice of sitting meditation in Buddhism to notice it, name it. Okay, this is anger. Okay, this is fear. Okay, this is insecurity. Okay, this is some sort of anxiousness. But for example, when you hit anxiousness in meditation, you're supposed to do the onion thing and peel some layers back and see what's under that discomfort of fidgetiness, or that story of, I can't sit here and do this. Really? Really? Yeah. And that's an interesting one. If you ever hit that wall trying to meditate, I dare you to push past it. I dare you to peel back the layers as to why. You're going to find something probably very intense and very vulnerable. And I'll put my money on anger, because that's very often the first one that'll come up once you peel it back. And what's even a crazier doozy is when you can't find either an A to B reason for that anger or an object for it. And that's when you really get stuck sitting, because you're sitting with something that is just the organic feeling, and you become that 1-year-old in the crib learning to have to self-soothe when mom's not coming with the bottle, not coming with a blankie. You've thrown your toys out of your crib and you got to deal with that feeling. That's why I love developmental psychology, because it really, those moments of sitting with something, I think Pema Chodron calls them sticky in meditation. They're very, very like the descriptions in developmental psychology of the baby, the infant, alone, confronted with that moment of narcissistic, impotent frustration where the love object, mommy, is not coming. Not as quickly as you want anyway. And you're really, for the first time, confronted with your own human personality in those moments of frustration. Not that we have any memory of that, but my point is that if you turn later in life to a body practice, meditation specifically in this, you're really brought back to that state. And no amount of therapy can bring you a confrontation with yourself the way that sitting with yourself in silence can. But the original point that I had wanted to make, that this had brought up, was that yes, I did have laundry lists when I was a child and prayed in the Christian tradition. I did have a hope that there would be satisfaction in response. I did have a series of fears, which I was, in that same way that a child sitting in the crib is hoping and expecting this outside source of comfort and wisdom and caretaking to deal with. There was a great deal of, I'm just going to hold everything that is my fear, my desire, out in prayer to this divine source, and they're going to fix it for me. And of course, the reason that many of us become disillusioned in Christianity is because there's a lot of us who had the same experience. We're expecting some divine inner voice or divine great, white-bearded man to jump out of a cloud and help us. We don't really have a conception of God. And I think it is because of that separation, because you cannot be that, because you are so beneath that, because of this really, really crummy interpretation. And this is very much me, so if this offends some people, too bad. The conception of sin, because the way that has been shouted down by Christian priests at people does nothing but make everyone feel bad and creates more separation from the divine, from the Godhead. And then even with those that call themselves penitent or faithful or devoted, that, crawl themselves head bowed into buildings of God, the Christian God these days, they're even more separated, no matter how much they show up for services. If they're showing up as lower, as guilty, as beneath that, they're so far separated. Whereas once again, as Matthew brought up, the Eastern discipline of thou art that allowed for a lot more. And so what happened in those moments of sitting with the uncomfortable feeling, when I found myself on the meditation pillow, the baby in the crib, in my body I was holding good yogi posture, breathing, sitting straight up, holding my body in, looking like perfect little meditator there, and lotus legs on the pillow. Early in the morning, before sunrise, with all my other yogi trainees, I pulled a good image, just like I pulled a good image in the office. But as compared to the prayer, where I did have, like when I was in work mind, in Christian prayer, I did have that laundry list of prayers and hopes and requests and fears. So it was just a noisy dialogue in my head. There was no silence. And as we went through our yoga teacher training, I think they ticked us up from maybe 15, 20 minutes of sitting in silence to, the time sort of trapped away, but I'd say it was 45 to 60 minutes in sitting meditation by the end of the month of training. And our teachers knew what they were doing, and they're guiding us, so it's not like you're in dead silence, but there's long periods of it where you're stuck dealing with your own stuff. And the way that I learned that doctrine was they're speaking to you as you're sitting there in silence. And I'm sure other people who meditate have this experience with their teacher, that their teacher will say something right at the moment they're like, I can't sit there any longer. And they'll say something about discomfort, or they're feeling angry. And the teacher will sort of psychically say, like, so if anger's coming up, and you're like, how did you know that? And that's a conversation for another time, how everyone falls into sync with each other. And there's just, as my teachers Tracy and Esther said, a little bit of precognition. You just start to know a few seconds before someone says something what they're going to say. Which is, it's not woo-woo, people. It's just our birthright. We've just cut off that ability in our minds. Hate to break it to you all. It's not a far-out concept. And so, because they were talking me through all those sensations and emotions that were coming up, one is interchangeable with the other, they were walking me through holding myself. They were not coming to my rescue. They were not being mummy coming to get me in the crib. I was on my own with that stuff. And you could say it's a harsher discipline, but it's also closer to the reality. And I think very much because the orientation is, I don't think it's ever actually even said, but, you read all these great texts and you expect to meditate for umpty years. And when you read the really, really far out ones, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, God comes through and it sounds like someone's dropped some LSD or something, especially in the Upanishads. When Arjuna says to Krishna, reveal yourself to me, he's like, well, if I really did, you'd burn up, which is, I think it was Semele, who was the lover of Zeus, and she said, please show yourself to me, and poor girl turned to ashes on the spot. Not a good idea. And so you know through those stories from the East that you can see God and he will reveal himself to you. Whereas, just like the Greek myths, the Christian God, he's going to definitely burn you up because you are the crummy little human to the God. But Krishna's sitting in the chariot with Arjuna, they're friends. He's come down and incarnated as this little human servant to teach him about himself, aka God, his own divinity, and his role in the divine plan. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, epic, sacred poem, the Bhagavad Gita, about a human finding his interplay with the divine and how the divine is literally driving his chariot. It's such a profound image. And so because this was the doctrine, because I was sitting on my own, I was on my own to deal with this discomfort. I was accompanied by someone who had experienced the path before, someone who had walked it on her own with her own pains and her own issues. And that's where that sort of what I called psychicness of what Esther would say to us when we were meditating came from, because she had to sit with her own difficult emotions and her own life story and her own disappointments of what life gave her that she didn't want and what life didn't give her that she did want, because we all have that. We all have that. And there's something very, very unifying sitting in a room full of women all going through that. And because we were on our own, but we were accompanied as well, and because there is this doctrine in the East of it will come from within, Not someone coming off a cloud, not a cosmic mommy coming to get you, no magic true love coming to be the great romance of comfort and everything in your life. Because no one can be that God in your life. And because there is something scary in that edge of emptiness and frustration, and because I was no longer seeking outside myself with a list of help me, help me, help me's, I think that is why it came up from within. That is why I had profound mystical awakenings. And it's important to note, those only came after I had a major somatic traumatic memory come out of my body. And that was the full deal, in meditation, screaming, crying, full post-traumatic stress, like memory of a violent event in my past. And I was consciously in touch with that pain in a way that had never been before. And then began a series of steps that was an initiation. That somatic traumatic memory was like a boil being popped, because I'd had 11 years of therapy already. I could say that ex-boyfriend was a jerk, and he was abusive, and he was controlling, and he was a narcissist. I could say all the right psychological words. But what happened in that moment was my soul said what it hadn't said. I screamed, why? Why are you doing this to me? And it was the one thing I hadn't been able to say. The one thing that hadn't come out in the therapy room. But after having done a full workout yoga class, that means bringing my system in from the arousal state of fight, flight, freeze, which I was probably in chronically, down into parasympathetic rest, digest, and having done this for several days, day in, day out, I really let go in a body scan, and I really went deep, perhaps almost into a hypnosis state, which is why I've always been interested in psychoanalysis and hysterics, because I was really, really relaxed. And I let come to consciousness, which could not in any other therapeutic setting up until that point. It came out there. It came out through body work. It came out when there was a meditative practice of sitting and getting comfortable with uncomfortable emotions being felt in sensation in the body. And when I came to study Jungian, well, more mythology, but Jungian depth psychology, later in my studies I saw that call from the body. That was a call, what we call in the hero's myth, that was a call. That was the beginning of an initiation. The violent occurrence had also been an initiation. This is why the story of Persephone echoed so much for me. It was pointed out to me by several Jungian colleagues I started working with who were very, very advanced in their Jungian studies in Colombia. And they all would be like, you're a Persephone. I'm like, I'm all what? You sound completely crazy. And that was because I went down. I went into my own underworld. I went into my own darkness. It's very symbolic. Persephone is quote-unquote raped, violated, and taken to the underworld. And anyone who knows trauma and then healing from that trauma with effort, like you have to want to, they know that you got to go into your own underworld there, because you can't spend the rest of your life being angry and pointing fingers. It's very important to get in touch with that anger and understand that you've been violated and wronged, but you can't stay there. And so for that, you got to go into your own underworld to heal and release. And there's a lot of bravery in releasing, and there's a lot of vulnerability in it. And that vulnerability requires holding. And I was in a held space with people, with practice, with doctrine. And I don't think that would have come up in a Christian religion, because there's such a misogynistic history, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work for helping heal an individual's psyche. It just creates more separation. Yeah, and so that was the beginning of the steps of initiation. That was the call. And so actually to set you up for next week, as well as to round out that stream of conscious thought and sharing, I was inspired when I got to hear Dr. Bessel Van Der Kolk speak about 2 weeks ago. And so I just want to read you a relevant passage out of his famous book, The Body Keeps the Score, Mind, Brain, and Body in the Transformation of Trauma. And this is from the chapter Healing from Trauma and Owning of Yourself. He studied yoga and particularly did one of the first studies on the effects of yoga and PTSD. And so reflecting on what I just shared about the differences between Western and Christian culture and praying and meditating is going to carry into the conversation next week. Mainstream Western psychiatric and psychological healing traditions have paid scant attention to self-management. In contrast to the Western reliance on drugs and verbal therapies, other traditions from around the world rely on mindfulness, movements, rhythms, and actions. Yoga in India, Tai Chi and Qigong in China, rhythmical drumming throughout Africa are just a few examples. The cultures of Japan and the Korean Peninsula have spawned martial arts, which focus on the cultivation of purposeful movement, being centered in the present, abilities that are damaged in traumatized individuals. Aikido, Judo, Taekwondo, Kendo, Jiu-Jitsu, as well as Capoeira from Brazil are examples. All these techniques all involve physical movement, breathing, and meditation. Aside from yoga, few of these popular non-Western healing traditions have been systematically studied for the treatment of PTSD. No mind without mindfulness. At the core of recovery is self-awareness. The most important phrases in trauma therapy are notice that, and what happens next. Traumatized people live with seemingly unbearable sensations. They feel heartbroken and suffer from intolerable sensations in the pit of their stomach or tightness in their chest. Yet avoid feeling these sensations in our bodies increases our vulnerability to being overwhelmed by them. Body awareness puts us in touch with our inner world, the landscape of our organism. Simply noticing our annoyance, nervousness, or anxiety immediately helps us shift our perspective and opens up new options other than our automatic, habitual reactions. Mindfulness puts us in touch with the transitory nature of our feelings and perceptions. When we pay focused attention to our bodily sensations, we can recognize the ebb and flow of our emotions, and with that, increase our control over them. Traumatized people are often afraid of feeling. It's not so much the perpetrators, who hopefully are no longer around to hurt them, but their own physical sensations that are now the enemy. Apprehension about being hijacked by uncomfortable sensations keeps the body frozen and the mind shut. Even though the trauma is a thing of the past, the emotional brain keeps generating sensations that make the sufferer feel scared and helpless. It's not surprising that so many trauma survivors are compulsive eaters or drinkers, fear making love, and avoid many social activities. Their sensory world is largely off limits. In order to change, you need to open yourself to your inner experience. And again, that is from The Body Keeps the Score. And that just sets us up for next week, where I'm interviewing a yoga teacher, meditation teacher, and archetypal symbolist through his work as an astrologer, Alex Amorosi, out of Boston, Massachusetts. And with him, I'll be sharing my stories of my experiences in yoga teacher trainings, ones I've referred to, but I will share them in depth. And he's going to help me unpack both what he's seen in his experienced practice as a teacher, and then his perspective on those experiences as I share them, as they relate to what's happening in the collective as he sees it in the sort of bigger world picture, and the role that the rush to and the growth and attention to training in yoga and taking yoga and people participating en masse in yoga, what this has to do with coming out of our unconscious as a drive to bring us back into the body. And so that'll be a 2-part series coming up next week. Look forward to you joining us. In the meantime, remember, try and sit quiet and breathe. Sit with yourself.